So you'll notice throughout the presentation that I don't use the term criminal justice system. I use criminal legal system, criminal punishment system, carceral system, injustice system. I've been doing the work that I do for about 12 years, even though I've only been a lawyer formally for about 5. And what I've come to learn is the importance of language around systems of oppression and violence. And so as a lawyer, a person in a position of power, I think it's critically important for me to be very clear with language. If I see that something is not just calling it a justice system, is an injustice in and of itself and a form of violence, right? And it's perpetuating the myth that such a thing called justice exists in this system when I know it does not. And so that does, I'm not saying that for you all to take that on. It's just background, because people are sometimes like, what is a carceral system? It's the system of punishment that we use in the United States. So if you hear me using any of that language, that's what I'm referencing. And then the last thing is kind of my own point of executive functioning confusion. I have notes over here and this computer over here, so I might be a little confused at times with trying to get things moving. So to center the space, I want to focus on, this is a short video of William Johansen, who's a Black deaf man in Louisiana. He's currently at Angola prison in Louisiana. He's been incarcerated for 45 years. We believe he's wrongfully convicted. He's one of many cases that I am working on of deaf and disabled, deaf blind people who've been incarcerated by the system for myriad reasons, but often without any sort of semblance of justice. I'm just going to play this while I'm talking. I'm not expecting that you all actually understand what he's signing. Oops, sorry, I'm already having my executive functioning. Just so you can see a person who is incarcerated who is deaf and multiply marginalized. Often people don't believe me when I say that there are thousands of deaf people who are incarcerated, thousands of deaf blind, deaf disabled, hard of hearing, and blind people who are incarcerated in these so-called United States of America. He's telling a story right now about not having access to a telephone for 42 years. He has been was unable to contact anyone in his family, his own counsel, anyone, quite literally, for longer than most of us have been alive, right? That form of deprivation is what I've started to call virtual solitary confinement. The responses to most deaf, blind, deaf, disabled, and hard of hearing people who are in our criminal legal system, particularly in jails, prisons, and so-called detentions, even our kid cages, is that they're quite literally losing their minds, right? Because we are a naturally sociable people, right? Human bodies and minds are meant to socialize with others. So when you remove the ability to communicate, you quite literally are doing damage to the entire person and their body and their mind. My organization, an all-volunteer organization, fought for about 2.5 years, no litigation, and was finally able to get video phones set up in about 12 prisons now in Louisiana. That actually was unheard of up until 3 years ago when we were able to do it, to be able to negotiate and educate and all the things that were required to get that to be done, sans litigation. But I think it's one of the most important things. Litigation often results in our most marginalized community members being brutalized in retaliation for demanding access to that which should already be in place. So I just wanted you to get a visual of William Johansen, and while he's up here smiling, that's really what his personality looks like. You can actually see what his personality is like from him. Most deaf people are very emotive in this way. Just a note that's really important about language. So you can see on his right side the word inmate. So in prisons, so let me back up a little bit. During the time of segregation here in the United States, Black deaf people and white deaf people were segregated as well. And what happened, I know, people are like, what? Yes, true. Black disabled folks, white disabled folks. In some instances, white poor folks were actually segregated with Black people who allegedly had disabilities, which is a whole other conversation. The history of institutionalization in this nation is like super informative, and I suggest if you all haven't researched it, you do research it. Asylums actually used to be called prisons. People who were in asylums or so-called mental health hospitals now were actually called prisoners. Euphemism, right? So the ways in which the United States English speakers have changed language to make things feel better, but we really are looking at precisely the same thing. So it's prison to be in a psych hospital, it's prison to be in a so-called mental health hospital, et cetera. So anyways, the reason I bring that up is about language. Different deaf people, and so during the time of segregation, obviously different sign languages were developed. So if you're not aware, sign language is a full language, ASL, American Sign Language, for instance. Full language, own grammar, own syntax, own structure, no written component. So most deaf signing people don't necessarily know English if they're here in the US or in Canada. And then if you go to any other country, there's complete other sign languages used. So folks who are migrating to and from don't necessarily share a sign language, really important as well, especially in the current context. So anyways, in prisons, what we're seeing right now in 2019 is precisely the same as during the time of segregation and the development of language. Why? Because many of our deaf folks in one prison would never be able to communicate with deaf people in another due to the language separations and developments that happen. So in Louisiana, the sign for inmate is this, where you're moving down your, which makes sense, right? Because visually you have an inmate here, so you sign. Up in New York, where people wear green who are incarcerated and the COs wear either blue or white, green is the sign for inmate, quite literally. The color green is the sign for inmate, right? And then, of course, all across the nation, that's going to vary. What that means is if you have an interpreter, the interpreter is not necessarily going to be able to understand people from different places based on dialect, accent, and other things. So that's just kind of a point that I thought might be of interest. The same is true in the context of court. So of our certified interpreter population in the United States of ASL, are 88% white women. And they are interpreting in our courts. And if you look at the certified legal interpreters in our courts, I think it's something like 90+% are white women. And they are interpreting for groups of people for whom they've never interacted. They don't understand the culture. They don't understand the language. They're voicing things that would never come out of these folks' mouths if they were speakers. Don't understand the signs, but continue to just interpret as though things are hunky-dory and that they understand everything and vice versa. So that's another, I think, point of interest. And I guess I'm giving you a primer to how wrongful convictions of deaf people happen. So moving on, just want to open this up really quickly. What's your definition of ableism? Anybody? This is not, you're not gonna like fail class if you, yeah.
I just
Angela.
as it's like kind of, I think of it as like the racism of ability. Like it's that the world is created to serve able people and favors able people, and it's contagious to people with less ability.
Okay, okay. Other thoughts? Any additions? Who here has heard the word ableism before? Okay. Yeah, it's not actually that common to hear it talked about, which is what makes it difficult to pinpoint and understand when you're engaged in ableism, which if you're abled, you're an ableist in the same way that if you're a white person in this country, you are a racist because you benefit from the system that is set up for you and not for others, quote unquote others, so everybody else gets otherized, right? The same is true for abledness, and it's important that we clarify ability is varied in the context in which you sit. So for instance, at Gallaudet University, all of you who are non-signers would be disabled, right? Gallaudet University is the only university by and for deaf communities in the world. It's over in Washington, D.C. Everyone on campus knows American Sign Language. No communication barriers for students who are deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled, hard of hearing. Although there's ableism on campus, which is another conversation. Communication generally for sighted deaf people is pretty good. So classrooms, teachers are using sign. Peers, sports, everyone knows sign language. You all would not be able to order food, go to class and understand what's going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so contextually speaking, where we create access, we actually remove disability, right? Those students are no longer disabled in that context. Same is true in society. If we were to make a society in which everyone here knew sign language, all of our buildings were accessible, we wouldn't actually have disability in the traditional understanding of it. So I'll get more to that later, but for the time being, a very short definition of ableism that I will encourage you all to think about, and I have a much longer one that I'll show you at the end, is that it's a system. So again, in the same way that racism is a system, it's not the individual person who discriminated, it's not the lone teacher who won't provide the accommodations, although that is a form of ableism. Ableism in terms of the system is a system that decides who's valuable and worthy based on their appearance. So I'm talking about lookism, people with facial deformities, people with different visual depictions of what their body looks like. It's different, it's not the same, it's quote unquote atypical. Those folks experience extreme ableism in our society. Or also the ability to produce, excel, and behave. Behave is in quotes, but really all of it should be in quotes. So this idea of excellence, right? So when we think about schools, for instance, the idea of the student who gets straight A's being the excellent student and not paying attention to the student who gets straight C's, but is taking care of their siblings, working where needed, and so on and so forth, right? So you can't actually compare those two students, but we always do. And that's true in this class as well. All of you come from various backgrounds, but we want to judge folks using the same metrics, and that actually doesn't really work. Behavior, we see that often with law enforcement, right? This idea of comply or die, but what if I couldn't hear you? But what if I'm so stressed around law enforcement that I can't process and I can't function? But what if I just lost my parent and I'm grieving and I can't process information right now? There's 1,001 reasons why a person might not be able to respond in a coherent way. Often it's because law enforcement themselves can't get their own orders in order, and people are quite literally flustered trying to follow 17,000 orders at the same time. Right now I'm working on an ode to the runners. It's an ode to Black and Indigenous people who run from the police, right? If you are a Black person in the United States, I see head nods from some of the folks who are Black or of color in here. You are Black or a person who is what I call negatively racialized. I don't like the people of color moniker. Everybody here has a race. We're all just racialized in different ways. So white people here actually have just a positive racialization on their identity, and folks who are not white in the space, in this context, I'm talking about police context, we are negatively racialized. And so what we unifiedly have is when law enforcement comes around us, we have a particular feeling. I haven't quite been able to name what it is, but it's a feeling. And if I can go anywhere in this nation, and ask a Black person, do you have this feeling when the cop comes around? They're like, oh my God, I had that too, right? The problem is that the framework of what we've been handed here in the US is a very white, wealth, privileged framework of what it means to be disabled, of what it means to be human, right? So what disability often is in other people's contexts, in non-white, non-wealthy contexts, is feeling, like sense, right? So the urge for Antoine Rose, who was shot in the back 3 times by East Pittsburgh police, to run from the cops, a 17-year-old kid, Black kid, who's from a community that's over-policed, he's constantly harassed by cops. It makes perfect sense for that child to run from the cops. Doesn't matter about guilt, innocence, anything else. It makes sense, especially as an adult who's Black, who has precisely the same urge that I've been able to control because I'm a military kid, which is a whole other conversation, right? So thinking through what it means to be human, how much expansiveness do we allow particular people to be human, to have disability, to have feelings? Because what we know is that if Sarah, Sally, Tom had the same instinct, the same fear, the same anxiety, Bill, what's wrong? There'd be a conversation, a dialogue. Well, I'm nervous because I saw someone who looked like me get shot yesterday on social media. Okay, well, I'm not going to shoot you right now. I just wanted to talk, like that's what would happen. But in our context, when we look like we're fidgeting or we're shaking or we're sweating, we look guilty, right? And that's the criminalization not only of Blackness, not only of poverty, but also of disability. Because that instinct, whatever that feeling is that I still haven't quite figured out what to name it, which I'm working on that, whatever that is would be deemed disability if it were expressed in a white skin. right? So if Sally's shaking and crying, she's got anxiety, even over text, right? So, and if you look at all the phobias that exist in the United States, what's funny about it is we've got test phobias, we've got people phobias, we've got fear of death, we've got fear of everything except cops. Like there's literally thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of phobias in the United States. What does not exist there is a fear of cops, right? That's just one example of a gazillion that I could share with you from the Black experience of being over-policed, of experiencing lots of violence by police, even as an attorney, because it doesn't matter who you are, what class you happen to be in, not here, how you're treated in these instances. And so that's just kind of food for thought. So this should be our framework for ableism for the rest of the day moving forward. And we can challenge that, if you'd like, a little bit later. So here I have mass incarceration, a uniquely American crisis. And many people might say, well, why are we so unique? And here's the answer. This is the United States as compared to a number of different countries in terms of our incarceration rates. We're quite literally, and on many of the charts that have been provided, they just make the US off the charts and don't even bother counting us. That's how ridiculous we are. So we're the worst in the world in terms of incarceration, or the best. Like we are exceptional at that. And right now, I think we are at incarcerating about 700 people per 100,000 in the United States. Obviously, the closest countries to us are countries that we are constantly complaining about their human rights violations. One is Russia. The other that's not listed here, which is less than Russia, is Rwanda. And the other, I think, should be, and it's not listed here, China, which again is still less than Russia, somewhere around here in the 300 area. Now, interestingly enough, with Rwanda, we of course know that there were human rights, there were like genocides and civil wars, etc. So there's some things that can be explained around that. With the United States, we don't necessarily have that same explanation. So folks are always wondering, well, what is it about the United States that makes it so incredible, not incredible? And just to give you some of the basic stats, we have 10 million arrests per year, 11+ million people cycling through our jails alone annually, 500,000 people currently in jail simply because they're too poor to pay to get out, 2.2 million people incarcerated in all of these systems, 70 million people with criminal records. Mind you, we only have 300 million people in the United States. And then hundreds of thousands of folks who are deported annually. I'll get to how many cases are played out a little bit later. And importantly, in this population, since I don't know how much of this presentation I'm going to get through, the vast majority of these folks who are incarcerated are people with disabilities who usually live at what I call the margins of the margins. So they're usually disabled, low income, disabled indigenous, disabled Latinx, disabled Black, etc. So disproportionately so, right? And so before I dive in, this is one of my favorite quotes by Frederick Douglass. He says, "I appear today as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master and ran off with them." It's a statement to the ability of our system to create crime out of natural instincts, right? So not only at the bottom here, it's kind of cut off a little bit for some reason, but there's a word, drapetomania. So most people now, everyone's like, oh, Frederick Douglass, oh, Harriet Tubman, oh, wonderful people escaping enslavement, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with Martin Luther King. Folks are, oh, wonderful, man, freedom and liberation. That's now, right? After they're all dead, after they've all been killed off by this really violent system, right? So it's easy to applaud people 15, 20, 100 years later. But at the time, Frederick Douglass was not only a criminal, but he was deemed insane by white eugenicists. So that word down at the bottom, drapetomania, Harriet Tubman, anyone else who escaped enslavement was deemed insane, quite literally, right? So drapetomania was literally created and said, you know, people who have the unyielding urge to run away from their master, right? Really, what happened in these instances, and so there's not just drapetomania, there's dysphagia aethiopica, which was work stoppages by enslaved people who said, we're just not gonna work. deemed insane, and it was later deemed criminal in many of the states that existed at the time. But work stoppages were deemed insane. And the way that we see that in current day are things like excited delirium. So when children, it's often seen in mostly marginalized children's school records, when people are trying to put them in restraint and seclusion for so-called bad behavior, and the kid's like, don't touch me, and does this, oh, excited delirium, puts it on their record. Now the child has a mental illness, when really it's like, respect my autonomy and don't touch me when I don't want to be touched, right, is what the child is saying and expressing through that behavior. And we have now labeled the child as some sort of insane. Excited delirium also is current day seen in a lot of the murder homicide records of a lot of the folks who die in custody in jails and prisons. So Natasha McKenna is a great example from Alexandria, Virginia. She was naked, Black, clearly in the midst of a mental health crisis, but she's naked in the jail, talking to the guards, COs, saying, you promised not to kill me. This is before they murder her. She knows she's about to be murdered by these people. She's not violent. They restrain her to a chair, tase her to death, and then say, oh my gosh, you died. Then on her homicide record, they say, oh, she died of excited delirium, right? So if you go and look at a lot of the jail records, the prison records of a lot of the deceased folks who have developed mental illnesses in the prison as a result of conditions of confinement, you'll find this strange concept of excited delirium, which no one seems to be able to explain what it is. The same thing is true with running from cops and so-called resisting arrest. If a club is coming down on your head, the natural reaction is, let me put my arm up so I can protect my head. That all of a sudden becomes resisting arrest, right? We know that resisting arrest across the nation is the most commonly used charge that exists, right? It's the most common charge in the nation, across the board, doesn't matter where you are. And we also know that often it's literally a person saying, don't touch me. Like, asserting that becomes some sort of violation of the law. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Want to move to this concept of power. And I use this little visual. It's a visual of a man seated at a desk, a human seated at a desk, and he's talking to several different kinds of animals, an elephant, a monkey, a dog, a fish, a seal, and some other things, and says, for fair selection, everybody's going to take the exact same exam. Go climb that tree, right? So of course, some of the animals are like, easy, no problem. The bird, of course, monkey's like, great. I'm sure the elephant's probably like, well, I could push the tree down, but I'm not sure how I'm going to get up it. You know, the dog's probably like, well, I'm pardon my language, I'm screwed, I can't do that, right? So but this is exactly how we challenge our students in classes current day, all the standardized testing. And then we'll label some students who just simply can't do it, less intelligent than others. Importantly, standardized tests were developed during, they're actually about, I guess they're about 105 years old now, standardized testing that is. They were developed and provided, the first standardized tests were given to enslaved folks and poor folks and folks who were migrating to the United States, specifically to test their intelligence. The tests were developed by people who spoke a different language, were from a different country, and given to people, and then if the person so-called didn't do well, they were deemed less than intelligent. IQ tests, all of the tests that we think are some measurement of something of value are actually not that relevant. So I failed the bar exam 2 times before I was able to pass it, right? But if you look at these standardized tests, what is important to note about them is, one, who develops them decides and determines who's going to pass them. 2, you never see anybody's names on the test who look like me, right? I don't see a Vasil, I don't see a Jermaine. I only saw Anna, and I saw Bob's, and I saw, what other names do we see on these standardized tests? Tom, I saw a couple of Toms, right? On one of my exams, I saw a question about a tanning salon. Right. And so while other people, and of course in the instructions, it says, all of the information you need is right here in this exam. But that's true only for a certain set of people. If you're asking about golf courses, which was on another one of my exams, golf courses and tanning salons and other things, and I don't see myself represented in this test, the angst that immediately starts is present. It's there, right? So it's easier for people who see themselves in that exam to take that test. So I'm just thinking about me sitting and trying to take the tanning. So it's a short question, relatively speaking. I must have spent 10 minutes on it because now I've got high anxiety because I know that I'm not a good test taker, right? Because that's been drilled into me. Then I'm thinking, I've never been to a tanning salon. I wonder what they do there. What do they need me to know from this question? Quite literally, this is what's going through my brain, while all the other students I just prepared for this test at the tanning salon yesterday, I'm ready, right? Not my life experience. And so understanding that the people who develop the test really do determine who's going to pass these tests is really important. And that's not just for SATs, LSATs, ACTs, all those things, but everything else as well. So when we think about criminal legal systems, the people who design the laws determine who's going to now not either violate or not violate the law. This is why we see folks who have particular less than harmful charges, i.e. possession of some sort of alleged illicit substance, receiving hundreds of years in some cases, versus people who literally clear out people's retirement accounts, often receiving a slap on the hand, right? If that, in the best of situations. And so keeping that in mind is important as well. These things are all related. So we were talking about power just then. Determining who has access to resources, where resources will be allotted. This is just a simple image from a museum that says since the 1980s, California built 22 prisons and 1 university. Again, who determines where the money is going? And even in this case, it doesn't depict here, but present, I think as of 2 or 3 years ago in California, to educate a K through 12 child, the investment was about $9,000 as compared to the average amount for annually house and one incarcerated person was around $60,000. So obviously we're talking about, and in many of the, especially with the privatized prison industries, what we know is they determine where they're going to set up a prison based on 3rd grade reading levels, right? You can look at the 3rd grade reading levels in a particular area and decide that's going to be the place where our next prison goes. And then of course, once you set up a prison, bar a few exceptional circumstances where organizers make sure that that prison doesn't get filled. Once you set up a prison, you are going to fill the prison, right? Because otherwise it's money going out the window. Yes, I see a hand.
The 3rd grade reading level?
Yes, I think I'm going to explain it when we get to a couple of slides down. So pin that, and if I don't, remind me. Actually, let me explain it now, because I'm jumping around quite a bit. In our carceral system, in our jails and prisons here, presently in the United States, if you look inside the prison, open it up, look inside, who do we find there? Often people say, oh, the monsters of the monsters, so-called violent criminals, et cetera, et cetera. But what we know is who we find there are disabled folks, folks who didn't have access to formal education, right? So in the same way that we've marginalized TL, who keeps failing the bar exam, failing the LSATs, not doing well on all of these tests, oh, not so smart, except I've been named, so it can't be both, right? I'm either a genius because I'm named top 30 thinkers under 30, or I'm really just not so bright, right? Which one is it? The other answer is I was working 3 jobs during undergrad, homeless, still going to school full time, and maybe that should be factored into where my intelligence lies on this scale of grand intelligence, right? Or maybe it's we shouldn't even be evaluating these so-called measurements of intelligence. Maybe the answer is that there's different forms of intelligence, right? And that all of these different forms should be valued, right? So the child who can tell you every lyric of every song that they've ever heard, that's a form of intelligence. But is it uplifted by the academy? No, not really, unless it's classical music, right? Unjust, right? But the people who are in positions of power determine who's smart, who's gifted, who's valuable. And that's how these things work. So in our prison system right now, I believe something like 60% of the adult population reads at or below a 4th grade level, which is functional literacy, and 80% of our children read at or below a 4th grade reading level, which is, again, functional equivalency. So again, when we're looking at the system, the question isn't what's wrong with you people. The question is like, what's wrong with society that we've created a system that literally funnels people into this thing of violence simply because we failed them in the first instance, right? So it's this reframing, this reorienting of understanding who is in there and how did they get there and whose fault is it really? And the answer always comes back to all of us. We're all responsible for this. And we continue the blame game, which obviously isn't helping anyone. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, my question was more like what you said, that the third grade level is where how they choose where to put the prisons.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're putting them in areas of like, I don't.
Come on, come through.
Or I mean, like.
Based on what I just told you, why would someone set up the prison in that particular area? Anybody can chime in and help out.
They deem it as like not valuable.
That might be it. What else?
Tia, from K through 3, you're learning to read. Then from 4 to 6, you're reading to learn. So if you haven't gotten there by 3rd grade, you're not going to get it, or it's going to be hard for you to go on
Okay,
and be better.
good. I saw some other hands, other thoughts. Come on.
It's just a shorter funnel. You can just open the door and then right out of school and there.
Think more prisoners.
Logistically.
Okay, logistically makes more fiscal sense. Other thoughts?
No. They're aware of that.
Right, it makes business sense. So if you follow the money, this idea of following the money makes perfect sense, right? If the people with the money who are making money off of incarceration know that the invaluable humans who everyone's going to be trying to get rid of, right, the undesirables. And remember, in the United States, we've had ugly laws that literally criminalize people for allegedly being unconventionally ugly, for begging in the streets, that's criminalized, that's modern day loitering. All of these things have been criminalized. Escaping enslavement, criminalized, right? So if we can make crimes out of things, we can figure out ways that we know, and it's not only that these folks don't read and write, it's that we know that those folks are now disproportionately represented in other populations as well. Low and no income, disabled, right? Reservation, right? All of these things are like, they're interlapping and feeding off of one another. And someone said something? Houseless, homeless, home insecurity, food insecurity, all of these things are connected to disability in ways that most people don't recognize. The people who do recognize are setting up our prisons and making money off of these folks who are most vulnerable. Speaking of powerful people, who is the most powerful person? Just like, say we're in a criminal court, and we have a defendant, and we have the prosecutor, and we have judges, we have the jury, we have the legislature who's decided the laws. Of all of these people that you can think of in the criminal law context, who is the most powerful? What'd you say, Angela? The prosecutor? Why do you think the prosecutor?
I'd say because they know the law in and out and know how to kind of paint the story a certain way to apply it to this case that they're trying to get to the
Okay, prosecutor. Other thoughts on who's the most powerful actor? Okay, the police. Why the police?
Because they have a lot of discretion about who gets arrested and then what the story is. And there's not a lot of oversight. And they're trusted.
Okay, who else? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, they're trusted. They're given the benefit of the doubt.
Okay. What do you think?
I think the jury would be very scary to me because they're the ones that really decide whether you're guilty or innocent.
Okay,
I
good.
don't know.
Okay.
jury.
If there's a jury, right? A lot of the cases are bench trials. Other thoughts? So the answer is the prosecutor. But it's not necessarily for the reasons that you mentioned, Angela, although that's included. The reason our prosecutors are the most powerful people in our system is because they decide what laws to engage, who to charge, when to drop the charges, how many of the charges they want to levy, and so on and so forth. And because they have full immunity when they are engaged in all of this behavior. And there's reasons behind that. We call it prosecutorial immunity, which I don't have time to get into. So the prosecutorial discretion piece is this, their full right and privilege to decide what charges get levied against whom. So say Prosecutor Joe Schmo is having a good day and, thinks Adeline is nice looking, probably a good mother, maybe stole that milk just to feed the children and shouldn't be punished for that, great. But TL gets arrested for the exact same thing and says, look at this. Just again and again, I'm seeing the same people coming through here, or I'm having an off day as Prosecutor Joe Schmo. Everybody goes in today, right? And it sounds like I'm being facetious, but this is precisely how these things are decided, unfortunately. More interestingly enough,
Do you think a white prosecutor has more power than a prosecutor of color?
the question was, do I think white prosecutors have more power than negatively racialized prosecutors?
I'm sorry, I forgot.
Oh, no, you're fine. No, I'm not correcting you for that. I'm just processing
I
the
like what you
question
said, though.
and trying to figure out how I want to answer. I think I answered by showing you this first, that it doesn't matter how much power we have when we are 5% of the prosecutor bucket, right? So this is a visual that says 79% of our prosecutors are white men, 16% are white women, and 5%, so 4% are Black, or all negatively racialized so-called men, people who identify as men, and 1% are, so I'm not sure that it matters how much power we have in the grand scheme of things when we are quite literally a mere scintilla of the group who is doing the so-called judging of people whose shoes you've never been in, right? So it's not just that you have this power, it's that you don't understand what it means to be houseless or homeless, right? Your experiences, the language you use, your responses to people in positions of authority, completely different than the folks you are now laying judgment upon, meting out justice upon, right? And that's the important part. So I don't even know that I can answer that, but to tell you that when I walk into courtrooms, I can be in my best dressed suit. I wouldn't show up like this, although I've thought about it a few times just to upset a few people. I am not given the same respect, acknowledgement. I often am confused as a person who, which bless, I don't care that they can, like in the grand scheme of things, I don't have any judgment against people who are charged with crimes. So the fact that I am seen as that doesn't bother me inherently. It's this idea that the only time a Black person can be in a space of carceral control and violence is when they are being subjected to it. There is no presumption that I am an attorney ever. And that's based on age, that's based on my queer identity, that's based on my skin color, mostly based on my skin color, based on my perceived gender, etc. And so questions like that are a little bit difficult for me to answer simply because intersectionality, right? Is that there is no, and because it doesn't really matter. That's what we're looking at. It does matter in that folks could change that. But I think the other important piece of why we're seeing so many problems is this question about trial. So because so many people watch SVU, Law and Order, and all the CSI, what are some of these other shows? I knew someone was gonna come with something else. All of the shows, people really do think that most of these cases are super adversarial, that there's some great, well-intentioned lawyers on both sides who have the same amount of knowledge, who have the same resource access, who have equal playing field, so to speak, and that they have their best interests of the country, the state, and their clients at heart, right? That's what people really think about our criminal legal system. People also think that we're actually going to trial with most of our cases, which I'll tell you now is not true. So I'm gonna, I don't believe in tests, but I'm gonna give you all this small test right now. I really don't give my students tests, which is a whole other conversation. The question is, what % of cases go to trial? So there are several ways to resolve a case. The two that I'll talk about now, because these are the two primary ways. One is pleading guilty. And the other is obviously going to trial. So trial, most people are aware of. Pleading guilty is what? Anyone? What does that look like?
Signing a paper.
It does look like signing a paper. That is.
You accept fault.
Say it again.
Accept fault.
Accepting fault?
Even if you
Interesting.
don't believe it.
Okay, that's a great caveat. Even if you don't believe it. Accepting fault, even if you know that you didn't. So guilty plea is, yes, the government offers you a deal and you accept their alleged deal in exchange for a lesser punishment. Okay. I have a lot to say about that, but let's just answer the question for right now. What percent of cases do we think go to trial? Raise your hand if you think A, 75%. No one? Okay, that's because I already told you the answer. Now, darn, I gave this one too. Anyone think B? No? Good job. 17%. Okay, about half the classroom. And 2 to 3%, about 3 people. And those 3 people, 4 people, are correct.
Wow.
I know, it's a shocker, right? And it's human nature. So what, and I tell people all the time, I'm a lawyer, I work on wrongful conviction cases. I would plead guilty in the United States courts of law pretty much every time. And there's reasons for that. People plead guilty to get out of jail because jail is violent, disgusting, because you lose your job, your kids, your apartment, everything over a couple of days in jail for something that you shouldn't even be there for. Most of the people who are in jail, 86% of the people who are in jail quite literally just cannot afford to get out. So yeah, the only option then becomes pleading guilty to something, and everyone is pushing you in the direction of pleading, right? Your own lawyer saying, you know, we're just not gonna win this at trial. And they're serious. You won't win it at trial, right? It's not even necessarily that the lawyer is making stuff up, lying. You probably will not win at trial, right? Especially because most people don't know how to interact with police and they end up talking too much, and then there's a lot of the information that is collected and then used against them, and they don't even realize it. But yeah, you probably won't win. Our sentences have been ratcheted up in the past 40 to 50 years. So whereas the same crime would have gotten Namisha in the 1970s, 80s even, a smack on the wrist, a little bit of time, maybe even a fine. Now, Namisha's looking at 20 years to life. What? Oh, I'll take that plea bargain any day. 5 years compared to 20, I'm Black, disabled, in the criminal legal system, I speak a different language. No thanks, I'll take that plea. That's literally what's happening, right? So, and that's at the state and federal level. So I think most people are shocked to hear that the founder's dream of an adversarial legal system is shit. It's not, it doesn't work. And the reason for that is because we have millions of people a day funneling through the system. No one can keep pace, even if you wanted to. So a lot of people give a lot of slack to public defenders. Bless their hearts, they're doing God's work in most cases. They are overwhelmed and under-resourced, right? They have no resource. People think they have the same amounts of money as the prosecutors. Not true, not even close to true, right? They're supposed to be working in some cases with less than 50 cases in the felony sense, less than 100 in many, and many are looking at over 500 cases, one person. You could be the best attorney in the world and can't handle those cases. Now you become ineffective, right? So the system has created a space that incentivizes everyone pushing these people along. You don't want to take, and of course the government, that's a win for the prosecution. They don't care whether they go to trial and get their win or if you plead guilty, because that's a win, they check their box. Of course, it doesn't really matter for the public defender. It's kind of a win to get your client to plead guilty because you know you can't win at trial because you don't have enough time to go do the investigation that's needed, to collect all of the evidence that you need, to actually put on a good case. You can't do it. Then we have judges actually incentivizing plea bargains because their docket is too full, right? And so the entire, again, we're talking about systemic problems. It's not about the one individual, all the blame game of the one person, the prosecutor. Everyone in the system is guilty as hell, right? And that's really important for us to be able to explain very clearly when we talk about what are the problems inherent in the system. Now think about, in public, and I think in New Orleans, the Public Defender Service has an average of 7 minutes to meet with their client before they have to go talk to the judge about their client's case. In Detroit, it's something like 32 minutes, right? So what we're looking at is a system that everyone knows that there's no justice here. You can't have justice in 7 minutes. But now add to that disability or cultural difference. First, a young person who's taught not to look in the eyes of particular people of different ages. Oh, you're lying, right? So all these things, or a disabled person who quite physically cannot look people in the eyes, right? Why are you evading my questions? Looks like you know what I'm asking about. You're not telling me the truth. Why? All the things, right? And so layers and layers of that. Also a deaf person, and interpreters are required. But most lawyers are writing back and forth with folks who don't read and write English because they use sign language or some other ASL or some other sign language, right? So all of these things play a role in who is being served by this system. So yeah, this is just one case. How much time do I have?
25 minutes.
Okay.
To go to 6:45 or 5:45.
Okay. I wanted to take a break. We might not have a break, you all. Just one example of how this is specifically deaf, disabled wrongful conviction. Just a quick look at, and Latinx actually. So just a quick comparison of these two folks, both of whom were wrongfully convicted of heinous crimes. Stephen Brody was on you all's left, deaf, first formally exonerated deaf exoneree. Formally exonerated deaf exoneree, that is true. Although there were many Black folks, a man named Junius Wilson was held for 76 years in a psych ward for being Black and disabled and deaf. He's not here. A man named Joseph Hurd, the namesake of my organization, was incarcerated in DC for 2 years. A man named Abe Zemedegegehu, who was a naturalized citizen from Eritrea, was held in the Alexandria jail for 6 years. Those folks are Black and low income, so they didn't get formally exonerated, right? So that's a whole other conversation. This is the first formal exoneree. And next to him is Juan Melendez Colon, who was also wrongfully convicted, different states. Stephen was out in Texas and Juan was in Florida. So when I talked to both of them, I talked to them in their native languages, Spanish or sign language, right? Those are their native languages. Our criminal legal system is not just set up on English, it's set up on a very elite Latin-esque version of legalese, which is actually a different language. If you go sit in a court and listen to the legalese, you're kind of like, what on earth just was said, right? And that's lawyers, much less lay people, right? So add to the layer of not understanding the language to having now legalese and Latin and other things on top of it. You're anxious, you're nervous, all the things. Both of them were wrongfully convicted and spent 17 years. Juan gets upset when you don't say that he spent 17 years, 8 months, and a day, most of which in solitary confinement on death row, came within minutes of losing his life on numerous occasions at the hands of the state. The interesting parts about their cases in terms of similarities is language access, poverty, and what folks in the legal profession, and I guess in the health professions as well, like to call limited language proficiency, which is actually a very ableist framework. They actually both have access to great language. It's just not English, right? And so we actually say everybody else is limited when maybe they're speaking 5 different languages and like you only speak one, you English speaker, you, and everybody else is like, oh, problematic, even though they don't. Anyways, that's a whole other conversation too. But you can see how these frameworks abound in the United States. Oh, you can't speak English, something's wrong with you. Oh, but I speak 5 languages. Not English though. Like, it's very bizarre. Super white supremacist. This is from a different transcript of a different deaf person's case that I worked on. The deaf person was accused of obviously hitting someone. The deaf person said to the cops, "I'm not understanding you, please provide me an interpreter," which is required under federal disability rights laws, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Rehabilitation Act. No one's following that, not doctors, not nurses, not judges, not prosecutors, not defense attorneys. Like, no one is following these laws, which is why the law won't save us. Deaf person begs for an interpreter. Cops like, oh, come on, you can do this. Let's just go at it. Let's just do this. Deaf person 4 hours later is like, I get up, I'll just go ahead and try to write back and forth with you. And the deaf person writes, girl I hit did not. So what does that mean in English? In English that, anyone. Who here specializes in English?
It looks like they're accepting blame.
Looks like someone's, it looks like, girl I hit, didn't I? Oh man, I must have hit her. And everybody watch TL, because in sign, girl hit. What did I say in sign language? It wasn't me. I don't know who did it, but it wasn't me. And that's, 5.5 words, 4.5 words, person is wrongfully convicted, right? Just like that. That goes on the record, so the person doesn't even realize that it's quote unquote wrong in English because they're trying their best to, quite literally, deaf people who are wrongfully convicted, I was trying to help the cops. Literally, trying to help the cops. Not help, but it's a very deaf culture thing. Help you, help me. It's our cultural thing. So most deaf people are actually wrongfully convicted because they were quite literally trying to help the cop understand them, help the cop understand a friend. So deaf people usually will bring a friend because they know no one's following the law. Come help me explain these things to the cop. Sits down. Now there's a hard of hearing person interpreting for the deaf person, or a kid. I've had kids interpreting for the parents. Domestic violence situations. It doesn't make any sense, but this is what's happening. All that goes on the record. No one really challenges it. Fingerspelling cops too, they're the best. So anytime that there's a cop who knows some sign, fingerspell, which obviously if you don't spell in English, you can't fingerspell either. That gets written down. Of course, the deaf person, if you can't read the paper, and this is hearing and deaf people, but at least with hearing people, you can hear what's being said. You can process that. Deaf people can't even hear what's being said, so it's assuming that all that they're trying to express is on that paper, signs the paper, that goes to their defense attorney. Defense attorney's like, why are my clients always confessing to things, right? Defense attorney isn't hiring interpreters, so doesn't understand their own client. Fast forward, the deaf person now sitting in jail for 2 years, no communication access, no access to their attorney, no access to anyone, no access to family, no helping with their own defense. Fast forward to trial 2 years later, and the deaf person's like, oh, is that what they were saying? I never said that. But who's gonna believe you now? Not one person, right? And so that's how the system is set up. And that's not only deaf people, right? That's folks with disabilities, that's folks who speak different languages, that's hearing folks who speak English and read English who are being wrongfully convicted, right? So of course, if you add these other layers, poverty, et cetera, you're gonna see precisely the same thing. This is an actual transcript from Stephen's case, his interrogation with the cops. The cop says, how far did you go in school? And Stephen responds, oh, I go to school between September and April. Does everybody see the misunderstanding there? It's easy. This is with an interpreter, by the way. The cops interrogated him for 8 days. They claimed that they had an interpreter half the time, which still would be insufficient. But obviously, this is a lousy interpreter if the translation is coming off this way. But of course, the cops already had their crosshairs on Stephen or whoever else the wrongfully convicted person is, in this case, Stephen, and they can't get their brains off of that, right? And this is actually a psychological thing. So often people, there are some cops who are doing dirt because they're doing dirt and they know they're doing dirt, but we know that there are actually psychological factors into figuring out who is guilty and who is not. And what we know is that once the police officers have their mind set on Joe, TL, Namisha, or whomever else, it is almost impossible to get them to disconnect from that alleged guilt, which is how we end up with so many things pointing to Stephen being innocent and them dismissing them, making up reasons why it just didn't apply in this case. All those things happen in most wrongful conviction cases. Fast forward a couple of pages. Well, what did they treat before at Horizon Hospital? Asked the cop. Oh, they were so nice to me. They taught me how to play volleyball without hurting myself. This is literally an interrogation, folks. Fast forward a couple hundred pages. Well, why would the people over, this is the cops. Well, why would the people over there at Huntington and Balfour say that they saw you stuff a purse down the storm drain? What color of a shirt? So now he's really confused, but what are the cops thinking now? With that response and the ones that were all around this one, what would the cops think when they ask a pointed question about the purse being thrown down the storm drain and the suspect says, what color of the shirt? What is the cop thinking? Anyone?
That he ain't wrapped too tight.
Okay, they're not thinking that he's not wrapped too tight. What are they thinking?
They're thinking he's asking him, if the cop, if he knows what color the purse was that he stuffed down the drain.
You are not cops, and it's great. The cop here is thinking, you know exactly what you did with that purse. You're evading the question. And now they've gone harder. So now he's anxious, trying to figure out and understand what is going on. What do these people want from me? Which makes his answers even worse, right? Trying to process the information. Anxious people shouting at you. They left the lights on, didn't feed him. All the tortures that happened during these 8, 9, 12-day interrogations. So he's not functioning at 100% at this point. And he doesn't have access to language. And they are shouting at him, right? These are not some like, oh, tell me about, this is, why would you kill her? the 7-year-old, why did you rape the 7-year-old girl? For anyone, that is quite literally traumatic, showing pictures of a brutalized 7-year-old child, right? And he at this time was a teenager himself. And what he knew he was guilty of was stealing money from a machine. So with most of the wrongfully convicted people, they've done something. Usually obviously isn't what they're being charged with. So they're thinking to themselves, maybe I should just give it up about I did steal those coins from that candy machine. And then like, what? So he's on some other page. They're talking about something that he doesn't have any idea about. And he's thinking about stealing literally coins from a candy machine. That was what he thought he was being interrogated about. And then they shifted to rape of a small child. And he couldn't process what was going on. Spent 17 years in. Importantly, with Stephen, like most of these folks, he was a ward of the foster system. So if you don't know, here in California, I think something like 60 to 75% of all people who are in adult prisons here are former wards of the foster system, who usually hit our prisons within a year of being released, or what do they call it? Independentized. Yes, these things. Quite literally within a year in most cases. I think 1/3 of them are going in within a year. Again, the question then becomes, who's at fault for that? And it's usually not the child, or the young adult or adult at that point. Just around the connections between poverty and disability in the United States context, what we know is that folks who are disabled are disproportionately in communities that are low or no income. And that's because of discrimination, right? So many people think deaf people can't work, can't be good supports in different areas where they are actually fantastic. And that's due to societal discrimination. Same is true with folks with other disabilities, folks who are from other marginalized communities. Oh, you know, women can't do this, that, the other. Oh, trans people can't do this, that, the other. Don't want to hire them, might be a problem. All of that actually leads to these folks being disproportionately represented in low and no income communities with little or no resources. And so just kind of linking that to the criminal legal system, transcripts cost a lot of money. So if you are trying to combat your case saying, hey, I'm actually innocent, and you come to my all volunteer organization, we need the transcript. You can't actually appeal a case without a transcript. So in Austin alone, one transcript, 1 page. Mind you, they have these borders that are like, they look like they're 3-inch borders. So there's like no words on each of the pages. Yeah, $5 a page. So good luck finding someone who can afford that. Most recently in Georgia, I was trying to get a transcript. It was gonna cost me $3,000 for one case of a Black, deaf, Latinx man, actually. So I'm speeding through some of this because I think we know a lot of it. The last was the 13th Amendment, which many people think ended enslavement, which it really just solidified the connection between the carceral system and enslavement. Here I have pictures of 2 different prisons, Angola, where William is, and Parchman Farm, Mississippi, which are currently prisons, both of which used to be plantations here in the United States, right? So understand, and many of the people who are currently working, these 2 pictures in color are actually incarcerated people working. And that's an overseer, a CO, with a weapon on a horse in Angola. And many of the people who are actually currently incarcerated in both of those prisons are descendants of enslaved peoples, right? And so understanding that history is really important. It often gets erased. Over half the folks killed by cops have disabilities. And I guess I should go back to this slide. It says when racism, classism, and ableism collide. So I'm just gonna kind of go through and help us understand where are some of these points of connection. This says that Black folks here in the United States we're actually 12% of the population now, represent 14% of so-called drug users, but 56% of the folks who are incarcerated for so-called drug-related crimes. Looking at literacy, I shared this earlier as a result of your question. 60% of the adults in the US prison system read at or below 4th grade. 85, I was wrong, I said 80. 85% of the imprisoned youth read at or below a 4th grade level. People with disabilities represent about 20% of the US population, but 50 to 80% of our prison population. I would argue that that is a very low estimate for various reasons. I think between 80 to 100% of the population that's incarcerated is disabled, and that's because prison itself is disabling, right? So if you go in without disabilities, you come out disabled. And that's how we actually know that it is, the percentage point should be much higher. Not only that, but I think something like 80 to 90% of the people who are incarcerated have a history of trauma, sexual, physical, other untreated trauma, which obviously leads to disabilities that often don't get diagnosed in particular communities. This is a stat that says kids with disabilities enter the kid prison system at about 5 times the rate of non-disabled youth. Skipping that, skipping this. I don't want to talk about the medical and social model of disability. This is probably the most important part, this disability being fluid. And I only have a few more slides for right now. Thank you for your patience. So this first one, disability being fluid, is probably one of the most important things that you might kind of try to process from this presentation, I hope. So disability being fluid is fluid in the sense of, with each disability, let's just think of cancer, which seems to be one of the easier disabilities that people, or diseases / disabilities, that people understand that if one person and the person next to you has the exact same kind of cancer, that your bodies respond to it differently. It's not going to be the same for you and you. Then if you have different resource access, how, what you're able to do to support yourself versus what you might be able to do, completely different. Your genetics also determine how your bodies are going to react. Your community also determines how your body's going to react. So disability is held in the individual and in the community different, right? So here, let's move away from cancer and move toward trauma and PTSD. What we know is that in some communities, our systems of health are particularly set up to serve those communities, right? So if, well, Marjory Stoneman Douglas, right? A bunch of kids from a relatively wealthy community are traumatized by particular gun violence, and immediately people get set moving to provide mental health support, all this emotional coping, grief, all the things, right? And yet in communities that do not have the same amount of resources, that experience that exact same kind of violence every single day, there is nothing, and by nothing I mean nothing, provided, right? And in a lot of those communities, what they're saying, what studies are showing, is that children have not just PTSD, but complex PTSD, because it repeats. So it's not like our vets coming home from war where they're back here, they're in a safe space, things are resolved, and now they're having these recollections and triggering moments, but quite literally every day is a trigger. Like, you can't get to school without getting through this, essentially a war zone in your own community. No mental health. I can't remember the percentage, but the ACLU just put out a report about the number of students who go to schools with no counselors, no mental health support, and no nurses, but have like SROs, cops in schools. But the numbers are just off the charts, and the off the charts piece is for kids that are in low or no income communities. So they have cops in the schools, but no counselors, which is obviously what's needed to support these kids. And so not only is disability held differently, it's also expressed differently. So our bodies obviously hold it differently, but so our children who are from particular cultures might express autism in a way that kids from other cultures don't, right? And it's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, it just is what it is. The problem is it's difficult to diagnose in particular children from these other communities, largely because of racism and classism, right? So the child who's acting out, who's from that low income background, becomes intransigent, becomes a terrible child, lazy, isn't doing their work. And the child from a well-to-do family is provided supports, behavioral intervention, all the things that federal law requires. And we're not seeing the same things. And so disability for Black and low-income communities, Indigenous communities, is often erased. So it's not named. So remember I told you that of the people who are killed by cops annually, over half are people with disabilities. Most of the names of the people you all probably know who've been killed by cops in the past 6-7 years have all been folks with disabilities. So Freddie Gray, who was the reason for the Baltimore uprisings in 2014, was actually disabled. Corinne Gaines, who was shot by the cops with her 5-year-old child, was intellectually disabled. Eric Garner had asthma and heart disease, right? Pretty much all the names. Tamir Rice had disabilities, was in special education classes. So most of the people who we know, the names of the people we know, actually do have disabilities, but that gets erased by media, gets erased by activists on both sides. So part of my work is talking to the disability community, saying, don't erase people's identities. So the deaf community, for example, a lot of deaf people have been getting shot by cops, murdered. Most of them are deaf people who are Black or Indigenous, right? So Magdiel Sanchez was murdered in Oklahoma in 2016, October. And the deaf white community came out with a statement that he was killed because he was deaf, no more murder of deaf people. And I'm like, you're erasing, he was intellectually disabled, he was from a low income community, he was a migrant, his family lived in a particular community that was over policed, and he happened to be deaf. So erasure of those identities makes it harder to stamp out that violence. And then on the other side, lots of activists who are fighting for racial and economic equity, they will talk about the race, but won't talk about disability. And again, on either side, what you're doing is actually helping to perpetuate that violence. Is everybody following what I'm saying? We have to be honest about what's going on. Media loves that because it's the simple story, right? It's the easy narrative. Oh, he was Black, the cops killed him. Oh, he was deaf, the cops killed him. But that doesn't help anybody, right? And so we just have to be mindful of that. And then the last piece about what disability is in some of our communities, that's a picture of J. Cole, for folks who don't know. He's a rapper. You should listen to some of his songs, like, there's lots of music. So the ways in which Black people express disability, Indigenous people express disability, because often it's so normalized, it's literally, you don't survive genocide for generations and not have trauma, right? You don't survive enslavement, which was brutally violent, and not have trauma, right? You don't survive poverty. Poverty is a form of violence, right? You don't survive any of the things that we're often talking about as health concerns, et cetera, without actually experiencing something as a result of it. Now, because in particularized communities that is so common, it doesn't even cross most of our minds that we have disabilities. Like, oh, that feeling that the cops, like when the cops come around, that's a disability? Oh, who knew? We don't get that privilege, right? It's a privilege to be allowed to be disabled in the United States. It's a privilege to be able to name these particular things. And when we look at the DSM, it's literally created by a bunch of wealthy white, mostly men. So a lot of the disabilities or feelings that women have, for instance, that trans folks have, that Black folks have, that low income people have, and anyone else at the intersections, that migrants, they're just not represented there. Or they're represented so off that you're kind of like, what were you white people thinking? Like, no, that's my cultural identity. I don't look people in the eye because my parents told me that their parents told them that their parents told them not to look adults in the eye. Like, that's how these things work, right? And so when you understand how the medical industrial complex has been developed, it's often been developed around otherizing of bodies and minds that are different than those who are deemed superior, which is why when I talk about ableism and racism, I don't disconnect them. They are quite literally inextricably linked in the US context. It's not the same in a lot of other countries for various reasons. When we're talking about erasure, most people don't know that Emmett Till, who was murdered by white supremacists, was also disabled, a survivor of polio, right? And what he ended up with, his mom, Mamie, who's to the left of him, taught him how to whistle, specifically to clear his passages, so people who had polio. So let me back up. Frederick Delano Roosevelt, the president of this United States of America, opened up, because he had polio as well, everybody remembers he was a wheelchair user, also had polio. White people all over the nation were given iron loans, support, medical treatment, and polio is one of many disabilities and diseases that has been deemed a white person's disease, and that was to perpetuate medical segregation. So even at Warm Springs, which was down in Georgia, FDR's donated all of this money to set up this polio treatment center. It was segregated, right? And Black people worked there and their kids could not get treatment there. They could not get treatment there. But when you look at the history of the United States, there's vast numbers of people who had polio. Fannie Lou Hamer, who most people recognize for her advocacy around voting rights in Mississippi, was disabled, was a survivor of polio. Wilma Rudolph, who won numerous Olympic awards, was a survivor of polio, right? So all the diseases that were white people's diseases, apparently Black people had them, and we're literally curing ourselves, right? And still succeeding. So it's wild when you actually think about it. So Emmett Till is one of another. I think people are coming in the back door. So one of another whose disability gets erased. And that's really, really important. And the same is true now. So some other disabilities that were deemed European diseases, multiple sclerosis. And I got 2 aunts with multiple sclerosis, right? But that still to this day is seen as a European disease, right? Polio, what else? Oh, schizophrenia, that's my favorite. So before the 1960s, schizophrenia was quite literally deemed a white man's disease. Arrived the 1960s and 70s, and literally in a 15-year span, Black men all of a sudden became schizophrenics, and white men stopped getting schizophrenia. It just didn't happen. Now, fast forward to 2019, what we know is that schizophrenia versus bipolar disorder, so if you're familiar with these disorders, alleged disorders, I actually argue that it's, anyway, that's a whole other conversation. They have very similar symptoms, right? So in terms of how they're expressed in many people, it looks very similar, schizophrenia and bipolar 2 usually, right? But now, even today, the chances of a white man going into a doctor, a psychiatrist, and being diagnosed with bipolar much higher than a Black man, even though the symptoms are pretty much the same. It's hard to figure it out. And how are these things determined? It's literally a decision by the psychiatrist, by the medical provider. So any sort of internalized biases that exist, anything that's being taught in the classes without this historical context, there's a book if you want to read about this, it's called The Protest Psychosis, and talking about schizophrenia and this shift from being a white man's disease to all of a sudden being a Black man's disease during times of protest. So this goes back to criminalization and disabling of dissent in the context of negatively racialized people. So drapetomania, which is like, I'm escaping, work stoppages, I'm like, all these things were criminalized and deemed insane. It's all related in these ways. So that's why I'm jumping around a little bit. So let me do like one more slide. That's a picture of Fannie Lou Hamer. So I guess this last slide for right now is, often people say, what causes disability? And it's a very passive way of understanding disability. I think it's actually a very problematic way of understanding disability. When you start to ask the question, how is disability created? You actually end up with different responses, right? So if I said, what causes disability? Usually you would say a car accident, or you would say, I don't know, what would you say if someone asked you what causes disability? Genetic mutations, what else?
I said genetics.
Someone would say genetics, what else? What causes disability?
Structure? I've
See.
never had it asked in that broad of a way, so I don't know how to answer.
Ah, okay, that's good. So maybe people aren't asking enough of these questions, and that's another thing, like
An illness.
illnesses. Okay, that's another usual response. But when you start to ask, how is disability created? You then start to put the onus in places where it might need to go. So in the case of the hungry person who is houseless on the street, who's talking to themselves because their body is having physiological responses to being starving, right? Oh, psychosis, like that is determined by a human, right? It's also determined by the structural situation in which that person finds themselves, and that is hungry. I use that example because I literally was involved in a situation where a person was talking to themselves, police were called, and all that person literally needed was food. They were starving, right? So we've created crises we've manufactured these crises that actually don't exist in a real sense. And we've allowed people to start blaming and laying diagnoses on people where really the solutions to these things are often structural and systemic change. So the question here is, how is disability created? Obviously violence and trauma, but deprivation is something that you often don't hear. So language deprivation for deaf people, most of our deaf children aren't being introduced to language until maybe the age of 6 or beyond. So 0 to 5, no language, I know, shock, right? 0 to 5, no language access, usually because they're born to hearing parents who don't understand the importance of providing access to a language that is accessible, right? And because doctors are telling hearing parents, if you use sign language, your child will never speak, which is silly on so many levels. But like, okay, even if my child doesn't speak, but they're able to learn, wonderful, right? And I can learn their language, but they're not gonna learn any of what I'm talking about around their head that they can't process, right? So most of these deaf children are being what we call language deprived, which obviously causes other developmental delays and disabilities. So that deprivation or deprivation of food, deprivation of shelter, housing, income and economic opportunity, education, that sort of deprivation causes disability. So that's how we can create disability, right? You quite literally can create disability if you say everyone must be able to pass this test and this whole community can't pass it. Now you're all disabled. And this is what this IQ test and all these things create, right? So there's all these people who don't do well on IQ tests are deemed intellectually inferior. Well, says who? Doesn't make sense. Society itself creating the disabilities, that's how we kind of talked about earlier, related to just access, spaces of access. Where is there access, where is there not? And society determining what is normal and what is not, right? So the truth is there is no such thing as normal, but people have put themselves in positions of power, and we've given people a lot of power, and they decide what is normal and what is not, and everyone else gets pushed to the wayside and becomes the margins. And that's true with all of the different marginalities that exist in this space even. And then the last and most important point is for public health purposes. So there's two last important points. The first is that in large part, the way that disability is created here in the US is the same ways that things like race and criminality are created in the US, right? Literally, society can construct these things however it deems fit. So that's the first thing. The second is that often in public health scenarios, folks in public health like to say things like, oh, you know, those adverse environmental exposures induce these long-lasting biological changes, and those cut across lifespans, and the DNA is changed, and sure, in some contexts that's correct. But what often isn't acknowledged is the fact that usually from generation to generation, so say we have a newborn child, their mother, that mother, and the mother's mother, all living in the same space, experiencing the same violence, experiencing the same trauma, the same food insecurity, the same violence by the state. Often they are experiencing those same things in the 60, 70 year span in which they live, and it's often just not decoupled out as societal issues. It's always put back inside the biological as opposed to the societal and structural. And so that's one thing. So we know that poor nutrition and food insecurity, wealth, income, and equality obviously lead to psychological, psychosocial stressors. All those things lead to poor health outcomes, but really challenging the notions around this generational idea of what it means to be disabled, or why everyone in this particular community has heart disease or has diabetes or has all of these things. Is it generational? Is it environmental, or is it a little bit of both? Is it, you know, that's something that really should be challenged and problematized. So I think with that, I'll end. Yeah, I think I'll end there for now. Okay.